I buried my husband 4 years ago. I stood over an empty casket in the rain, held my son's hand, and told him his father was never coming home. I believed it. I built a whole life on that belief. A smaller life, a quieter one, but mine. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, somewhere above the clouds, my 9-year-old son turned to me with a face gone the color of ash and whispered 4 words that split my world in half. Mom. Dad's back there. I laughed it off. I told him it wasn't possible. Then I turned around and I saw the watch on that man's wrist and I stopped breathing. My name is Marissa Cole. I'm 37 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, with my son Noah. This is the story of the trip that undid everything I thought I knew about my own life. The vacation had been Noah's idea. Or maybe it had been mine and I'd let him think it was his. Either way, it took me 4 years to agree to it, our first real trip since Derek died. Just the two of us, 5 days on the Gulf Coast. I'd booked a resort with a starfish-shaped pool because Noah pointed at the picture and said, "That one," without hesitation. And something in me cracked open with relief at seeing him want something again. We were at the gate when he first went quiet. I noticed it the way I noticed everything about him now, carefully, like checking a wound to see if it had reopened. He was staring past my shoulder at the boarding line behind us. Noah. He didn't answer. I followed his eyes and saw nothing but ordinary strangers dragging ordinary suitcases. You okay, bug? He nodded too fast. The kind of nod that isn't really an answer. I let it go. Kids get strange at airports. We settled into our seats, 14C and 14D, the row we'd picked together off the seat map weeks earlier. The plane taxied. Noah sat rigid beside me, knuckles pale on the armrest. When I asked what was wrong, he said it again, quieter this time, like saying it louder would make it more true. Dad sitting 2 rows behind us. I turned around before I could stop myself, telling myself I was doing it to prove him wrong. There was a man 2 rows back, aisle seat, a paperback open on his knee that he wasn't reading. Sandy brown hair, threaded with gray at the temples, in a way I recognized before I let myself recognize it. Broad shoulders, slightly hunched, the particular way of sitting a man adopts when he's trying to take up less space than his body wants to. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. His left hand rested on the armrest, and on it, a wedding band, his thumb turning it in small, unconscious circles. An old habit. I used to watch Derek do exactly that at the kitchen table doing our taxes. I used to watch him do it in the hospital waiting room the night Noah was born. I faced forward. My hands shook so badly I pressed them flat against my thighs. I told myself it was grief playing tricks, the mind's cruel talent for building a beloved face out of nothing. I told myself this for 3 hours, a story I no longer believed, while beside me Noah sat frozen, whispering things I didn't want to hear. When we were boarding, he looked right at me. Then he looked away really fast. I thought about the folded flag they'd given me at the memorial. The one with no body underneath it. The one the search teams never recovered from the cold water off the coast. I thought about 4 years of birthdays and holidays and Tuesday nights where I still, sometimes, set the table for two. The plane began its descent. Noah's fingers were freezing in mine. When the cabin filled with people standing and reaching for bags, I stayed seated as long as I could. Eventually the aisle cleared, and the man 2 rows back stood and turned, and for one full second, across the width of a commercial airplane, we looked directly at each other. It was Derek's face. Older, thinner, weathered in the way 4 years and a different life will do to a man. But it was his face, the face I had memorized in a hospital hallway, kissed goodbye 1,000 ordinary mornings, grieved until grief became simply who I was. My husband was alive. And he was looking at me like I was the ghost. I did not scream. I did not run toward him. Some instinct older than shock kept my body still while everything inside me screamed silently instead. Derek looked away first. He pulled a duffel bag from the overhead bin, said something low to a woman standing beside him, blonde, mid-30s. Sunglasses pushed up into her hair, and walked up the aisle without looking back. Noah gripped my hand so hard it hurt. That was him, right, Mom? That was really him. I told my son the only true thing I had. I don't know yet, baby. But we're going to find out. We spotted them again at the rental counters, her hand tucked into his arm, both of them laughing at something easy, unhurried. Like people with nowhere urgent to be and nothing to hide. The ordinariness of it was almost worse than the shock itself. I didn't confront him. Every instinct told me to. But something colder rose up beneath the panic, the same instinct that had gotten me through his funeral without collapsing. I needed information before I needed answers. So instead of running toward him, I followed quietly at a distance. They loaded into a resort shuttle. I checked the logo on the driver's shirt against my confirmation email. Same resort. The exact one I'd booked 2 months earlier on a whim because my son had pointed at a starfish pool. That wasn't a coincidence, and even in my daze I knew it. Someone had either known we were coming or something stranger was at work, and both possibilities terrified me. I called Grant Whitfield from the back of a taxi, my voice flat in my own ears. Grant had been our family lawyer for over a decade, had sat beside me through the entire process of having Derek declared legally dead. When I told him what I'd seen, there was a long silence. "Marissa," he finally said, "if that's really Derek, you understand what you're describing. You're describing insurance fraud. A man who let a death certificate get issued in his name. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime, one you unknowingly benefited from." I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd only been thinking of him as my husband, dead and now somehow not. I hadn't thought about the $240,000 sitting in trust for Noah's education, the policy that let me keep our house. Every dollar of it now sitting on top of a lie I hadn't known I was living. "Don't approach him," Grant said. "Just watch. Call me if anything changes." That night, after Noah cried himself into an exhausted sleep, I sat on my dark balcony and listened. Voices carried strangely along the row of balconies facing the courtyard. 2 floors down, 3 doors over, I heard a voice I'd have recognized anywhere, low, unhurried, the cadence he used when calming someone down. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. There was no more room for doubt. Around midnight, footsteps on the walkway below. I leaned toward the railing. Derek stood alone near the pool, phone pressed to his ear. Then, as if some old instinct told him he was being watched, he turned his head and looked directly up at my balcony. Our eyes met for the second time that day. This time, he didn't look away first. He held my gaze for 3 long seconds, then turned and walked quickly inside, like a man who just realized he'd been caught. But what happened over the next 2 days completely changed how I understood everything. By morning, I understood something that reshaped the whole picture. Derek hadn't been surprised to see me on that balcony. A man who believes he's run into his supposedly dead wife by pure accident doesn't calmly hold eye contact and walk away like he's closing a door. He panics. He runs toward you, or he freezes. Derek had done none of those things. He'd looked at me like a man looking at a problem he'd been expecting to arrive eventually. I dropped Noah at the kids' club and went to the front desk with a manufactured question about a billing error, the kind of small lie that gets an employee talking. I described Derek without using his name. The clerk pulled up a reservation, turned the screen toward me, then caught himself. The name on the room wasn't Derek Cole, it was David Fenn. A man doesn't accidentally end up with a different first and last name. That takes a passport. That takes years of quiet, deliberate work. I rented a car that afternoon and watched. I'm not proud of how easily I fell into it, parked 2 rows back, sunglasses on, pretending to read while cataloging everyone who came and went. Grief had taught me patience. Apparently, it had also taught me how to disappear in plain sight. I watched the blonde woman. I'd heard him call her Renee, laugh at her phone by the pool while Derek sat beside her, scanning the crowd the way a man does when he's used to checking exits. I followed them to a strip mall diner 20 minutes inland, the kind of place tourists never find. Renee waited in the car. Derek went in alone and sat across from an older man, silver hair, a suit too formal for the setting, a leather folder set precisely on the table like a prop rehearsed many times before. I sat 2 booths away, phone propped against a napkin dispenser, recording, praying the ambient noise wouldn't swallow every word. Most of it did, but fragments survived. The insurance won't reopen if nobody talks. Documents are clean, David. I made sure she can never know the account exists. I sat frozen through the rest, watching my supposedly dead husband nod along to a stranger's instructions. That night, I sent everything to Grant. He called back within the hour, and the careful lawyerly calm was gone from his voice. Marissa, I pulled everything I could on David Finn. Social security number, driver's license issued 3 years ago out of state. Credit history going back to right around when Derek's death certificate was filed. He paused. I also checked. It's still on file, still valid. As far as the state is concerned, your husband has been dead for 4 years. So which one is real? That's what worries me, he said. Because as far as I can tell, they both are. Don't do anything, he told me. Call me before you do anything else. I promised him I would, and I meant it. But lying awake that night, 2 floors above a man who'd let the world believe he'd drowned, I understood that watching from a distance was no longer going to be enough. I decided to talk to Renee the next morning, though I told myself for an hour beforehand that I wouldn't. She was easy to talk to, warmer than I expected, a laugh that came quickly and without guard. I hated how much I liked her within 5 minutes. She mentioned her boyfriend the way people do when they're happy and want an excuse to talk about him. 2 years together. He told her he was a widower, no kids, that he and his late wife never had children, that he'd moved out west to leave old memories behind. She showed me pictures on her phone, unprompted David on a hiking trail, David cooking in a kitchen that wasn't ours. Then one older photo, an anniversary dinner, his left hand resting on the table. Even scaled down on a phone screen, I could see it. He still wore his wedding ring, turned inward, the band facing his palm. Easy to miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Something in my chest cracked open, not with relief, not with vindication, something closer to grief. A man doesn't accidentally keep his wedding ring turned inward for years while building an entirely separate life with someone else. That's a decision, repeated every single morning. I excused myself before she could notice my hands trembling. That evening, walking Noah back from the kids' club, Derek found me, not accidentally. I understood that now. He stepped out from beside a row of palms, and Noah froze mid-step beside me. Derek looked at me first, 4 years compressed into a single terrible silence. Please. Not here. I wanted to scream every question at once. Instead, I nodded because Noah was standing right there, small and rigid, watching his father with raw, unguarded hope. Derek's eyes finally moved to him, and something crossed his face, pain, unmistakable, before he forced himself to turn and walk away. Noah didn't cry until we were back in our room. Why didn't Dad hug me? Is he going to come home now? I held my son and told him the only honest thing I had left. I don't know yet, baby. But I promise I won't stop until I find out. Later, on the balcony, I noticed a man in a dark jacket standing near the far end of the courtyard, not moving, not on his phone, watching. I realized with a slow chill, the exact section where Derek's room was. I had spent 2 days convinced I was the only one hunting for the truth. Standing there in the dark, I understood I might not be the only one watching David Fenn. And if that was true, whatever he was running from 4 years ago might not be finished with him yet. Derek came to my room just after midnight. I almost didn't open the door. Every instinct said to call Grant first, to not be alone with a man I no longer knew how to read. I opened it anyway. He didn't try to embrace me. He stood in the doorway, looking older than his years, and said the only thing that mattered. Everything you believe about what happened to me is only half true. I let him in. I told him to start talking and not stop until I understood everything. He told me about Victor Kessler, a name I'd never heard, a business partner in a shipping logistics venture Derek had quietly invested in the year before he disappeared. He said he'd stumbled onto financial records that didn't add up, transfers routed through accounts that existed only on paper, money moving in patterns that only made sense if the cargo being shipped wasn't the cargo being declared. He said he'd tried to go to the authorities quietly, and within a week, someone made it clear, without ever saying it outright, that his family's safety depended on his silence. They mentioned Noah's school, he said. They mentioned your route to work. That was the whole message. He told me about the boating trip. How it hadn't been an accident so much as an opportunity he'd manufactured out of desperation. A boat capsized deliberately, a life vest left floating where it would be found. A body that would never surface because there had never been a body to surface. It was the only way he could think of to make the danger disappear from our lives without dragging us through it. I didn't believe him, not entirely, not yet. If that's true, I said, then why didn't you come back once it was safe? Why did I get 4 years of silence and a woman named Renee who thinks she buried a wife who never existed? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way I remembered from the worst nights of our marriage, because I didn't know when it would be safe. And every year that passed, coming back got harder to imagine, not easier. I told myself I was protecting you by staying gone. I'm not sure anymore how much of that was true, and how much was just easier than facing what I'd done to you both. He handed me a small drive, along with a folded page of handwritten names and account numbers. Everything on Victor Kessler's network, documentation he'd quietly assembled from the shadows of his second life. Proof, if I wanted it, that at least the reason he'd vanished had been real. I called Grant the moment Derek left. If I had known what that drive would set in motion, I might have hesitated before handing it over. But I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. Grant took the drive the next morning without a word, disappearing into his room with his laptop for nearly 3 hours. When he came out, his face had the particular stillness of a man forcing himself to stay professional. It's real, Marissa. The accounts, the names, the transfer patterns, it all checks out against public shipping and customs records. This was serious enough that federal agencies would have wanted a piece of it. I should have felt relief. Instead, something colder settled into my chest, because the facts explained why he vanished. They didn't explain why he'd let his son learn to walk, lose his first tooth, learn to read, all without a single word from a father who'd apparently been watching from a careful distance the entire time. That evening, a black sedan pulled into the resort's front drive, official in a way that tightened my stomach before I even saw the man who stepped out, broad-shouldered, gray-suited, unhurried. He walked to the front desk and showed the clerk something I couldn't see from a distance, but I recognized the gesture. A badge, or its private sector equivalent. Grant's warning came back to me. If that's Derek, everything about his death becomes a crime. Someone besides us had finally noticed a dead man was still very much alive. The man introduced himself at my door the next morning as Owen Marsh, an investigator with the insurance carrier that had paid Derek's death benefit 4 years earlier. He was courteous in the practiced way of someone who delivered difficult news 100 times and made no attempt to soften why he was there. A routine data match had flagged a passport re-entry under the name David Fenn, biometric markers close enough to Derek's old license photo to warrant a look. My name on the original claim had led him straight to my door. I didn't lie to him. I told him what I knew, though I left out the drive, the details of Victor Kessler, that belonged to Grant until we understood exactly what we were protecting and from whom. Owen told me the company would be opening a fraud investigation regardless of any other circumstances. He was polite about it. It didn't land any softer. I confronted Derek that afternoon and asked the question I'd been most afraid to ask. Had he touched the money? He looked almost offended I'd have to ask, told me he hadn't spent a cent of it, had specifically structured his disappearance so the account would remain untouched. A strange, twisted act of integrity buried inside an enormous betrayal. Grant confirmed it within the hour. Every dollar was exactly where it had been left. Then why? I asked him, sitting across from him on a bench near the resort's empty tennis courts, the ocean loud behind us. Why not come back the moment you knew we were safe? You knew where Noah went to school. You knew when I changed jobs. That's not a man hiding from danger. That's a man who chose to stay away. He was quiet a long time. When he finally answered, his voice cracked in places it hadn't in years. Because every year I stayed away, I told myself you were better off, that you'd built something without me I'd only ruin by walking back into it. And the longer I told myself that story, the more true it started to feel. Even though some part of me always knew it was just the easiest way to keep hiding from what I'd actually done to you both. I didn't cry out of anger. I cried because I finally understood something about the man in front of me that no investigation could have shown me. Whatever protection he thought he was offering us, he'd also been serving a sentence of his own making. 4 years of watching from outside a life he wasn't allowed to enter. He hadn't escaped anything. He'd built himself a different kind of prison and moved into it willingly and called it love. It didn't excuse him. Grief and forgiveness are not the same current, and I wasn't ready to let one carry me toward the other. But something in me softened toward the shape of his suffering, even while the rest of me stayed furious over the years he'd stolen from our son. That evening, Owen returned with a folder of his own, and the conversation took a turn none of us had anticipated. Victor Kessler's shipping operation had drawn far more federal attention over the past 2 years than Derek realized while hiding from it. Investigators had already built most of a case through channels entirely separate from him. What they hadn't had, until now, was a witness willing to testify to how the operation had specifically threatened a private citizen into faking his own death. Your husband, Owen said, choosing the word carefully, wasn't the architect of anything. He was leverage. Someone used him to keep a much larger operation quiet. Whoever orchestrated the scheme that made his death look convincing, that's who we actually want. I sat with that for a long moment. Derek hadn't been the villain of this story after all. Not exactly. He'd been a frightened, flawed man who'd made an unforgivable choice for reasons that were at least real. But someone else, someone still out there, had built the machinery that made his disappearance possible in the first place. And that person had never once had to answer for the 4 years my son grew up without a father. If I had known how the story would actually end, I might have braced myself differently. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. The arrests came 3 weeks later, after we'd all returned home, and the resort had become a place I never wanted to see again. Owen called Grant first, and within a single conversation I learned Victor Kessler and 2 associates had been taken into federal custody on charges of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy, built on records reaching back years before Derek ever got tangled in the operation. The evidence he'd handed me in a hotel room had become one piece of a much larger case the federal government had already been quietly building. Derek was never charged with anything connected to Kessler's operation. Investigators were clear about that, and clear about crediting his cooperation. But faking his own death, filing false paperwork, and living under a fabricated identity for 4 years were crimes in their own right, regardless of how sympathetic the reasons behind them were. He turned himself involuntarily the week after we returned, walking into a federal building in a gray suit that made him look like a stranger. I sat in the hallway with Noah's hand in mine, while lawyers used words like restitution and cooperation agreement and time served, in ways that meant very little to a 9-year-old boy who only wanted to know if his father was going to prison forever. He wasn't. The judge, weighing 4 years of self-imposed exile against a man who had ultimately helped dismantle a criminal operation rather than profit from it, handed down probation, several hundred hours of community service, and a formal repayment plan the insurance company had already quietly agreed not to fully enforce, given the circumstances. It wasn't justice in any clean sense. It was simply the shape the law had room for. Renee left before any of the hearings concluded. I heard secondhand that she'd moved back closer to her family and hadn't spoken to Derek since the week the truth came apart in her hands. I thought about her sometimes in the months that followed, a woman who'd fallen in love with a man built entirely out of a lie, who'd lost 2 years to a relationship that never had a real name attached to it. I hoped, wherever she was, she'd found her way to something honest. Derek asked to see Noah before his first day of community service, and I said yes, though everything in me still hesitated. I told myself it wasn't for Derek. It was for my son, who deserved the chance to say whatever he needed to say to the father he'd spent 4 years believing was dead. It happened in my living room, of all places, the most ordinary setting for the strangest conversation of our lives. Derek knelt down to Noah's height, something he used to do naturally when Noah was small, and I watched the years of habit come back into his body even after everything that had changed. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he said, and his voice broke in a way I'd never heard in 12 years of marriage. Noah looked at him for a long time, the kind of long, unflinching look only children seem capable of giving. Then he said the sentence that undid something in both of us at once. "I already learned how to live without you." There were no tears from Noah, only a kind of calm, steady honesty that told me my son had grown into someone stronger and clearer-eyed than either of his parents had managed to be. Derek cried openly, kneeling on our living room floor, and I stood in the doorway and let him, because it wasn't my place to soften that moment for him. He had earned every bit of it. We didn't get back together. I want to say that plainly, because I think it's the ending our story actually deserved rather than the one a simpler story might have handed us. Derek moved into a small apartment across town, close enough to make his community service and his visits with Noah manageable, far enough that our lives no longer overlapped by accident. We became something neither of us had a good word for, not strangers, not a couple. Just 2 people bound permanently by a boy who loved us both, and by a truth we'd each had to learn to carry differently. Some evenings, watching Noah set the table for 3 on the nights Derek comes for dinner, I think about the woman I was on that airplane, certain she was losing her mind. I think about how much simpler it would have been if he really had drowned that day on the water. But simple was never actually true, and I've stopped wishing for the version of this story that would have been easier to explain at dinner parties. 4 years ago, I buried the man I loved because I believed he was dead. This time, I buried the life we could never have again, not with grief, but with something closer to peace. Derek survived the water. Our marriage didn't. And somehow, accepting that hurt less than living inside a lie ever did. So tell me, what would you have done in my place, sitting on that plane, watching a dead man breathe? Would you have turned around and looked, or would you have needed more courage than I had that day? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you.